Hey everybody, this is Perch. Let's talk about interconnectivity and longevity. So that's the title of an email from a viewer, and the viewer writes, "Hey Perch, hope you're doing well. Love the channel and the commentary. See if I can curse and be insulting, so we can, take care of that love." I'm just kidding. This is somewhat of a two-part question, or maybe just an observation that begs the question I haven't arrived at yet. I was sitting in my room, surrounded by my comics, looking at some of the titles and thinking about how great these stories were when I realized many of them are from a time when comic books were really gripping. Most of my books are Batman, Superman, Green Lantern, Flash, Justice League titles, DC fan. And the way these stories blended together, what was happening in one title sometimes blended into another, and the characters in their stories all felt somewhat interconnected. I don't really see this so much anymore, at least not to the degree where I'm looking back the last 2 years of comics and thinking, wow, those are an amazing 2 years of stories. It's kind of sad given the companies believe, at least, that they're doing more interconnectivity, but let's see. Um, Instead, I'm looking at stories from 10, 20, even 30 years ago and thinking, wow, those were really good times with great stories and great artwork. Why does it feel like the way the comics are going now that it will never get back to a point where the ball is rolling and things are just great or even just interconnected instead of being all over the place? Why is it the older books are still talked about with greater adoration and fondness than anything that has come out in the last couple of years? Sad when I think about it. I honestly can't recommend anything to younger readers from the last few years because nothing seems to be as good. What are your thoughts? Um, well, let's see here. Let's take the interconnectivity first. I think, and this is like you, maybe I haven't arrived, I don't have the perfect answer in my head, but comic books did seem to feel more interconnected, even though today there is a lot more pressure put on crossovers. And again, it's sad because I think both Marvel and DC would tell you that they have a tighter, more connected universe than before. They would point to how the MCU was tighter and interconnected, and that translates to the comics. And they talk about many of their crossovers and many of their events, and how you pick up one comic, you can read another. They'd be quick to also say, but you don't have to buy them all, because they're trained at this point to say that whenever you talk crossovers. But there were far fewer events and crossovers in the 80s and the 90s than there are today. Today, you have at least one going on always, and both companies have kind of moved to somewhere between 4 to 6 a year. Yeah, that's those are just the bigger ones, not even counting the smaller ones. But the interconnectivity seems less, and I think the thing where I come to is that even though back in the 80s and the 90s there were fewer events and fewer crossovers, there was more of a push to make sure that characters, if they were in a costume in one comic, it showed up in the other comic. It was seen as a flaw, an error, a mistake. If a villain appeared in two comics at the same time, or that came out the same month, and one comic was like set in Brazil and another comic was set in Japan. I remember there was a Lady Deathstrike that showed up in two comics at the same time, and she was like in the U.S. and then also in Japan in the same month. And there were lots of easy ways to explain that. I mean, this is a universe where people have teleporters, but still, Marvel was like, "Yeah, that was a publishing error. We didn't mean for her to show up like that," and I was charming. But you don't see that today, and why I think that matters is the interconnectivity. If you read, a copy of the Spider-Man, and you see Kraven the Hunter there, and then you pick up a copy of Squirrel Girl, it's a completely different character. It's a completely different version of Kraven. Just radically different personality, everything else. And he shows up in Deadpool for some reason, and he's acting different there. So it's like the personalities of the characters aren't consistent. I think a lot of that interconnectivity had a lot to do with that. The Flash sounded like the Flash, however you picked up the book. And when Wally West became the Flash, he sounded different. He acted different. It was clearly a different character because the personality was so established. And then if you went over and picked up Justice League, where Wally West was, the character would be the same. It's like Kyle Rayner, if he's an artist in one book, if he's an artist in Green Lantern, when he shows up in Justice League, they don't have him suddenly as a construction worker. He's still an artist. And it sounds silly, but there was greater care paid to that material. And I think it gave the comics more of a feeling of being connected, even though they weren't doing a crossover. It naturally felt like the same universe because the characters were the same, and I think that was great. There's definitely less importance to that now. I mean, a lot of what DC has done with their everything, the omniverse where everything matters, is that it did give kind of a blank check to writers to say just write whatever you want, just however you want to render the characters, do the characters, whatever. You also have radically different art styles. You got like Riley Rossmo over there. You got Phil Jimenez. You've got just very very different art styles in the book, and that too creates a level of discord. This stuff doesn't feel completely the same. So I think all those things are a factor. The other one, and it's will comics matter 20, 30 years from now in the same way? It's hard to imagine that there will be as many as we look back, 20, 30 years ago. We've got several kind of major stories being told, and today it doesn't feel like we're there. Um, Part of it's contemporary writing. Again, I've argued aggressively with people over this, but I think when you attach your comics to current stories, like you're making jokes about shows that are on today, and so Bendis did this. He made it very popular in comics to do quips and do jokes and do banter that was very topical, very in the moment. And you had a lot of other writers come on because he was successful, so you had a lot of people copy that style. But the effect is that these comics feel like a time capsule more than an everlasting story. They feel like you pick it up and they're riffing on the second term of Barack Obama, and you're like, it doesn't help this feeling of timelessness in a comic. It doesn't make it feel like a classic. It makes it feel locked in a certain time period. I think that's a factor. Yes, I think that the driving to political and social agendas in the comics has definitely taken a big toll on the books, and I kind of put that reason why I said the topical business because it kind of feels the same. People have been worked up about something, some kind of social cause, something they were worried about for a long time. Back in 2012, there's this thing Coney that was a big deal for like 2 months before it blew up, and the founder was naked on the streets, and it turned out to be a bit of a scam, or a lot of a scam. But it was there was a lot going on with that, and comics at the time were starting to they had characters running around with Coney 2012 on their shirts and stuff like that, and it ages terribly now. You go back and you read those comics, and you're either you don't know what that is and you don't remember it, or it's super cringeworthy to see that kind of stuff. And that's where a lot of the current social topics play, is that they're trying to, where we've got the abortion debate going on in the U.S. again because of some actions the Supreme Court's likely going to take. And so you're seeing, and there's a lot of writers threatening right now. It's like, oh, I'm definitely going to do a storyline on this. I'm like, how about don't do a storyline referencing a 2022 news story that is a social cause you really care about. Elevate it up somehow. If you want to write a story about abortion and that kind of thing, you need to make it something that it will still feel compelling in 2040, 2050. I think it's possible to do that. Again, there's a lot of comics that were out in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that had good social commentary and were able to reference these things in a abstracted way, so it felt more like a I don't know, a bigger message than just playing off of current events. But quite frankly, and I'll say it in the most blunt way possible, there are better writers in those time periods. I mean, you've seen a lot of comic writers during the 70s, 80s, and 90s who have gone on to write a lot of novels, best-selling ones, gone on to write movies. People like to attack Frank Miller, but Frank Miller's had a very successful career in comics and outside of comics because he's a very talented writer, also artist, but definitely a good writer. And there's just not a lot of those now. I'm not saying they're all bad. There's definitely some good writers out there, absolutely. But you had you had a wealth of really strong writers, really strong creative talents. You had really strong editorial that was making sure the comics lined up and that crazy ideas didn't make it to print. So, I mean, those two things are a major factor to comics, being important today. You have to recognize that the talent level was there's a lot more of it. It's never all or nothing. People are quick to be like, oh, so you say nobody is talented today? No, no, there are definitely talented people out there today. There are definitely some skilled writers who can do some good work, and a lot of people have their favorites. There's people who really love Chip Zdarsky, thinks he's a great writer and he's amazing. Okay, wonderful. You like Chip? That's cool. But I think that, can you name 24 writers that are, really really strong, and on top of that, are people that you could easily see transition into movies easily and be successful there, or books or anything else, that have a successful background as a writer? It would be very hard to do that today. Some people would struggle at a dozen. Could you also name a dozen editors that were of high quality? Again, in the 80s, you could easily rattle off a dozen editors that did a really good job. You couldn't do that today, and that's kind of the challenge. And yeah, yes, it's a matter of opinion, of course, but I think it's not entirely subjective, because you did see a lot of these creators, these writers, getting careers, bigger outside of comics. You see a lot of writers today who would like to have careers bigger and outside of comics, but haven't been able to pull that off. And a big reason is they're not that same level. So I would love to believe that comic books can get back to it would be really nice if 20, 30 years from now we can look back and have lots of classics from this time period. But I do think it's going to be tough. I don't see a huge amount of books that are going to be remembered in the same way. There'll be a few, but not in the same fashion. We are in a bit of a dry period, to put it mildly. Anyway, great question. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you all for listening.